Ladies and gentlemen, can I invite you to take your seats? I'd like to introduce Dr. Catherine McDougall.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming. When I was thinking about this lecture tonight, the task is rather ambitious. To cover all main Russian art movements of the 20th century in a space of a small lecture is a daunting task. So I think I would talk in greater details about what I think is more important for understanding Russian art of that period and skip some movements, and if you have any questions, you're welcome to ask later on. 1917, the Russian Revolution, obviously, was a political threshold, but not in any way an art threshold. So a Russian Revolution, in my opinion, happened before it happened as a political event. It certainly happened as a cultural event in Russia in the early 10s, so certainly from 1905 onwards. So just to remind you what was happening in Russia in 1900s and 1910s, abstract art, of course Kandinsky, of course suprematism and suprematics, of course Malevich, of course Black Square, Futurism, Realism. Those are the movements which I think were organically woven into the Western art, but were fighting in Russia and lost the battle. Just a few images to remind you what I'm talking about. Of the early 1910s, Kandinsky, obviously Black Square, 1915s. That was the year when Malevich sets up his suprematist group, which existed less than a year, but which consisted of all the main names of Russian and world avant-garde. Malevich, Popova, Klyun, Ekster, Rozanov, Udaltsova, Pestel, and so on. A great role of the period played, of course, Russian futurists, writers, poets, and artists. We show you here Zdanevich, but of course the main futuristic poet was Mayakovsky, who was also a very talented artist in his own right. He was the editor of the Left magazine, and he was the one who inspired several major art movements after the 1917 revolution, and Realism, of course, Larionov, Goncharova. And then I wanted to say just a few words about the non-avant-garde movements, very marginal movements in the context of the early 20th century, which is symbolic. Blue Rose, Jack of Diamonds. By the way, those two are the most sought after by the Russians themselves, the most expensive artists of the 20th century. In the same time, a lot less known in the West because they were not part of the avant-garde, but were rather part of the Russian aesthetic escapism. And of course, world of art, the movement that united the Diaghilev artists, stage designers, mostly. And the two people I thought worth mentioning here, even if not we're going to talk in detail about them, are the two people who created two major schools, which is Filonov with his analytical formulas, and Kuzma Petrov-Vodkin. So just a few images to remind what we're talking about. The Blue Fountain, 1905, Saryan, again, Blue Rose, 1905, Nude by Falk, 1916, Konchalovsky, 1910, and a few painters of the world of art. Benoit, stage design, Somov, Bakst, and Filonov and Petrov-Vodkin. But the dominant Russian art movement was realism, and just to remind you, that was the official art. It was the art of the salon. The most expensive artist of that period was Makovsky, who painted beautiful Russian princesses in the national costumes, who painted a lot of boyar scenes, who decorated beautiful estates, and marginalized, but still very much official, itinerants. Repin, Roubaud, 1912, a typical battle scene. He did a beautiful diorama for the Tsar, which was destroyed during the bombing. Makovsky, Surikov, and that's basically just to realize what were the images of the period. And then 1917, We have several splits straight away. We have Academy of Art closed, we have Unovis and Inhook opened. We have Школа Вояния renamed, we have new groups set up by Bolsheviks, by avant-garde artists, and by the old Russian artists of the realist school itself. Probably what you know best of this period are the artists of Unovis, the school which was set up by Malevich in Vitebsk in 1919. The pupils, apart from Malevich, who stayed in Russia, mainly went to the West later on. People like Chagall and Lisitsky became world classics. At the same time, the two major friends, Kandinsky and Malevich, were already fighting each other. Kandinsky set up Inhook in St. Petersburg, and where Rodchenko was very active, and Rodchenko then goes to Hutemas, and together with his compatriots will be very active in constructivism, but that's early 20s. So we've got Markovits set up by the graphic designers. So those are new schools created by seasoned avant-garde artists. So they're no longer on the margins, they're no longer student groupings, no longer scandalous, non-official artists. They're now quite powerful group. They control magazines. They have support by the state, and they're starting a war against Russian realist art. They're fighting each other, but what is important to realize that at this stage, it looks that the realist art, the old art, is dead, and instead, industrial art and avant-garde, the new art of the new country, is going to rule the planet. So those are the schools and those are the artists who seem to have won short-term victory over the old realist Russian art. And just a few images from the Unovis artist, Chagall of 1920. Unovis was set up in 1919. That's Lisitsky at Vitebsk School, then Rodchenko from Inhook, from very similar group of avant-garde artists, but grouped in St. Petersburg. I didn't bother to show you Proletkut and Markovits, but they were on the margins of futurists who also had their magazine and were very, very active. A few words about new art forms which were more or less produced by the revolution, and that's, of course, Russian posters. The first Russian poster was produced in 1918 and was already published in 10,000 copies print. Poster was an ideal new propaganda tool for promoting the new values for not very educated people, very simple and very to the point. With the help of Mayakovsky, the probably most famous series of Russian posters were produced in 1919 to 1921, which are called Okna Rosta, windows of the Russian Central Telegraph Agency. They were illustrations of the telegrams which were sent every day by Rost to the newspapers. It could be just one poster, it could be a series of posters with the same characters, almost like comics later on. So you have a Red Army soldier, you have a priest, you have a capitalist, you have Wrangel, and so on and so forth. So they existed for 3 years, and every single day there were new posters. The first ones were hand-painted, then they were silkscreen painted, and then later on, in the very end, they were printed. Then they were put in the train stations, restaurants, and magazines. And Shklovsky later on joked that the propaganda posters finished when the food reappeared in the shops, so they didn't have to bar the windows anymore with empty shelves. Russian poster school is very, very strong, but you probably know that posters took a lot in terms of narrative from the Russian Chestushki, folklore songs, and from Lubok, kind of naive art. The two main schools, if we're talking about political posters, are Denis, who was more satirical, and Moore, who was more political. So all the major posters, whether you volunteered to the Red Army or the posters of famine of Volga area, were all by Moore. Almost immediately, the first satirical magazine, Crocodile, was created in 1922, I think. So posters was the new propaganda art, and it was very quickly multiplying, and it was attracting very, very good artists from Kustodiev, Lanseret and Deneca to I don't know who. But that was the new form of art, which also was fighting the traditional easel painting and denying any use of the elite form of art for a few. Another thing mentioning what was happening in on the art scene at that time is graphic design illustrations for the National Library, for the Nationalная Biblioteka. Almost immediately after the revolution, Russians were doing publication of all the major classics, trying to make people more literate. They produced in great numbers the original versions of Dostoevsky, Pushkin, Tolstoy, and on. And those books were illustrated by major, mostly traditional figurative Russian artists, again by Kustodiev, Lanseret, and others. But it was a lot of work for them to do at this point, and they felt needed. And the other thing worth mentioning is a very special art propaganda tool, because in the first few years of revolution, especially in the first 5-10 years, they decorated ships, they decorated trains, they decorated streets and buildings, they had special parades promoting the same idea of the new world and for art for masses. We're talking about the new school setup. We're talking about new forms of arts. A few words about survivors, as I call them, quiet survivors. Diaghilev artists still exist, but they renamed themselves in Zhar Tsvet. Jack of Diamonds exists, but it's split into Batiye and Nosh. Blue Rose became 4 artists. So they were kind of trying to fit into the new world. There were new groupings, but the ideas of those groups were very much the same, and they felt very marginalized by the very, very aggressive avant-garde artist. And you have to remember that when we're saying that they were aggressive, we mean literally, because a lot of them became commissars, a lot of them worked for the government, not in some abstract, but in literal terms, like, say, Malevich, and I think Kandinsky, but it was the matter of food, it was the matter of life and death. And in response of that, just a defense mechanism, AHR was created, which is an association of Russian revolutionary artists. It is very important, and I want to attract your attention, because there's a huge difference of AHR was 1R when they were revolutionary artists, and 1R when they become artists of the revolution. That happens in 1928 on the first Congress of that movement, and it was, in a sense, the beginning of the end in a very clear format. AHR, the most pro-revolutionary, as you would imagine now, the very reactionary by late 20s, early 30s art movement, AHR, which was basis for the creation of the Union of Russian Artists, is the movement which was set up, as I would like to stress, as a defense against avant-garde artists who wouldn't let the old Russian artists be. If you know Russian art of the 19th century, you know that the main movement was the movements of wanderers or itineraries or передвижники. They formed a group of artists that moved from town to town, showing people their very realistic paintings in order to bring art into people's consciousness. So, AHR, that revolutionary, very left-wing AHR, the basis of the Soviet Union, the basis for the revolutionary art, was set up by the former academicians, by older and middle-aged artists to defend painting as such. And it was a very sincere attempt to defend both their lives, just as to defend the Russian art traditions as such. And the first exhibition, which took place in May 1922 to benefit the starving citizens, was immediately supported by the state, especially by the Russian army, because a lot of painters focused on the Red Army scenes. So if you look at the AHA members, you will see all the Russian classical 19th century artists. That's Arkhipov, Kasatkin, Mishkov, Yuon, Grekov, Malyavin, Petrov-Vodkin, and so on. So they formed the group which experimented with the relationship with the Soviets, with the relationship with the state. They were the ones who created this form of cooperation, which later turned into the single union of artists and counseled not just avant-garde, but all the other groups that there were. Here are some images of the paintings created during this time. If it's a girl, it's a pioneer with the book, like here in the portrait of Kasatkin. If it's Ryazhsky, it's also a young woman, determined young woman who joined the party or one of the unions. And if it's a Yeganson, another classical artist, then it is often a complicated setting, a group painting. But here, I would say the best Russian tradition in terms of coloristic decisions and impeccable composition, you beginning to see that it's more a farce, a caricature, than a real historic scene. Because if it's an officer, he's a bad guy. If it's a communist or a sailor, he's very determined. Now, it's a bit unfair because this painting is 1933, so it is already where we see the same artists when they became the union artists. I think the better example is Grekov, who actually later would be the founder, the chairman of the School of Battleists in Russia. If you see this painting, which is close to the time when Akhar was created, it's a painting called Joining the Budyonov Troop. And if you look at it closely, there is nothing that much glorifying the revolution. You see an emaciated, exhausted peasant with emaciated horses, almost like it's horse showing the way. He's not with his shoulders wide and spread, he's not looking particularly happy joining Budyonov army. It's more like necessity, and there's no other way. I wouldn't say it's a very optimistic painting, but if you look at Grekov of 1934, here you have the trumpeters of the First Color Army. Here you have those emaciated, starving peasants who joined with their dying horses. You see a completely different image of a very fierce soldier. So just on two images, how sincere some of them were in the beginning and how it turned out. I think I would want to say a few words about those artists who were in the Akhar, probably worth mainly talking about Brodsky, because he's a real example of what happened to some of the Russian artists under the pressure of the system. He started as a rapping pupil, he started as an admirer of Serov, then he was very active in the world of art. And then together with the painter Andreev, he basically created the cult of Lenin. He's probably one who's responsible for cult. Again, art goes before politics. Revolution in art goes before political 1917 revolution. Brodsky goes very much before cult of Stalin. He painted more than 200 portraits of Lenin, a lot of sketches. So they were creating an event before it actually materialized in the real world. So that's Lenin of 1924 against Kremlin, a very cheerful picture, and that's Lenin of 1930. That's the end of Akhar. That's very formal and not a very cheerful image. After Akhar, one of the main movements we're supposed is Ost. Because Ost, as opposed to old Russian 19th century realists who proclaimed realism the right choice of subject and documentalism. That's the Acher tradition. So they were naturalistic, they were true to life, they were true to depicting what they saw in a very 19th century terms. Ost was also an art movement which ideologically was very close to Acher. But as opposed to 19th century artists, Ost was set up by very, very young people, and they were deciding that the new life needs new art form. They were very much into industrial art. They incorporated various materials into the art. They were into posters. They were experimenting with metal, with wood. They were very familiar with German Expressionism, the canonic images, the images of the Soviet Russia. And you can actually see this is the works done when Dyneka was part of Acher. You see, this is an amazing masterpiece with its own rhythm. I can only quote Bloch, but they are keeping up with revolutionary rhythms here. Yeah? That's the year he left Ost. And that's 1947, when Dyneka is now the member of the Union of Artists. You can see the drastic difference, in my opinion, but still there is a lot of power there. It's Williams, Vyalov, Labas, Pimenov, Moscow. Those are the artists who said that in the 20th century we are going to paint differently. They existed from 1925 to 1931. As all other art movements, they stopped existing in 1931-32 because in 1932 you have a famous decree about literary and art movements, which abolishes all the movements in Russia and establishes Union of Writers in Union of Artists. And that's where we have socialist realism. I think that if you try to do a test and ask somebody, how long actually socialist realism exists in Russia, what would be the answer? Sometimes it feels like the entire Russian 20th century art is socialist realism. But technically, a Union of Artists was created in 1932 by decree. Socialist realism as a term was introduced in 1934. Then, very abruptly, by a political will, you have socialist realism, and it exists, obviously, till the Stalin death. So the actual socialist realism period is from 1932 to 1953. That's the classic images of smiling faces and cheerful collective farmers and very, very strong workers achieving incredible results. When Stalin died, as you remember, and that's probably my favorite period in Russian art, Khrushchev started a process known as Thaw. And probably the major event of that period is 20th Congress of the Communist Party, where Khrushchev said that Stalin was a mistake. If in literature the changes took place very, very quickly, you had Twardowski, you had Solzhenitsyn, art was very slow to respond because the rules were a lot less clear. Art was a bit neglected by the government, so people had to kind of decide whether it was safe at that point to become liberal and to decrease the self-censorship. But nevertheless, in spite of that, especially in the Moscow Union of Artists as opposed to the Central Union of Artists, which was dominated by the former Acher artists, the people who came to power and who were in charge of the exhibitions, people like Popkov, Nikonov, Geli Korzhev, they were mainly under 30. They were already recognized. They were going to international exhibitions. And they decided that their roots not only socialist realism, but they went back to Ost. They went back to the international experience, which was absorbed by the older generation, but they went a generation back to the late 1920s. And if you look at the main influences, especially early days of those painters like Andronov, Korzhev, Nikonov, Salakhov, you see a clear influence of Williams, Deineka, and Pimenov. You can see images of this artist of mid-50s to mid-60s. That's the art movement which was finished in Manege in December 1962. And that's Andronov, Raftsman, that's Korzhev. Korzhev always stood on his own, but it's one of the most important artists. That's Popkov, his iconic image of 1960s, Builders of Bratsk. And that's typical severe style. You see it's more like a poster composition, contrast of colors, flat figures, and non-specific faces, and not very cheerful faces. Main objection of Khrushchev, because he wanted to see a happy response to communism, not grim monkeys, as he put it. Salakhov, repair workers. And then, of course, you have an exhibition in Manege. And that is probably one of those opportunities missed by Russia for the next 50 years. The main artists who were meant to exhibit there was set up by their older colleagues because they saw that they're clearly losing. And a night before the exhibition, they cleared a cafe and a few storage rooms on the third floor of the Manege and brought amateurish group of Bilutin, because that was abstract art, and abstract art since the early 1930s was a Western-influenced enemy propaganda. So during the night, they collected paintings of these artists and put them upstairs in those cleared storage rooms. And when Khrushchev came, already very, very unnerved, they basically steered him to this top floor and showed this horrible art. So when he was provoked by seeing this abstract young artist, he went berserk. Khrushchev wanted two things. He wanted to feed the starving people, and he wanted to build a lot of houses. And here he says money of the poor nation spent on that. And after that, of course, you have various decrees saying that art became too bourgeois, that it infiltrated by capitalist ideas, and that we need different art. And that's basically when Russian non-official art goes underground. And as I mentioned in a previous lecture, it is not the government per se that split the artists. What split the artists and the society is the attitude of the official artists to the Bilutin group, because there wasn't a single person who supported those amateurish artists, mainly workers who came to paint after work. And a lot of them behaved like Neizvestny, very courageously, and had a dialogue with Khrushchev during the exhibition. But what I'm trying to say is that the severe style artists who thought they now have a freedom of expression now face the clear choice. Either they go to the right or they go underground. And that's when underground movements start. Until the mid-60s, you can't talk about non-official art, because all the artists were part of the artists' union. They all had rights to flats, to studios, to sanatoriums, to special food packs for major celebrations. And even though during Khrushchev, even though there were several years of major criticism of the severe style artists, only one person was expelled from the Union of Artists, and that after the Manege exhibition, and that was old Kropivnitsky. He almost did it voluntarily. But then comes a period when the non-official artists no longer part of the Union of Artists of various organizations, which means, according to the law, that they have no right to exhibit, because it is written in a law that only an exhibition can only take place if it's approved by, say, Moscow Union of Artists. So while on the one hand you have a stagnating union of artists, kind of a return to socialist realism value, but in a much weaker, smoother form. Or they went underground and they formed various groups, and there was a series of exhibitions which were not an art event, but more like a performance event, because an exhibition, if it lasted for a few hours, it was an absolute record. That is why all the exhibitions of non-official art, which took part in the flats or outdoors, they didn't last. The main non-official art movement is called nonconformists, and a lot of them were amateurish artists. They were not professionally trained. They were of different ages. Sometimes you have a son and the father in the same art group. They were very different, but they were all united by their political position. All nonconformist artists never had an exhibition or a book written about them in Russia. Yeah, if you can imagine, the whole generation of artists deliberately decided we're not going to cooperate regime, we won't have a personal exhibition or an album ever produced. That was a conscious decision of quite a few people. We have a section of nonconformist art. You can see the paintings live, but I just want to show the Sveshnikov and, of course, Rabin. So we have nonconformist, naive, almost domestic group, and in so-called bulldozer exhibition, they decided to do an exhibition outdoors in the outskirts of Moscow. Then when they came out to that field near Belayevo Tube, they discovered people planting trees. Apparently the artists who came with their paintings for this exhibition were disturbing the tree planters on Subotnik, on a volunteer day of labor. And that was the main charge. So that's how it looked for the whole world. And the whole world was not fooled. They had bulldozers demolishing paintings, so that's why that exhibition only took a few minutes. And it's kind of legendary because if you listen to people now, it looks like not 20 or 30 people were there, as the original sources were saying, but say thousands, like during the Russian coup and the defense of the White House. The next group of artists, non-official artists of the 20th century, is the group of called soc art, which is a cross between socialist realism and the pop art, because they were saying we're reacting not to commercialization of the world, but to the political ideology. And then, of course, that's sculpture by Orlov, Earthly Troops and Celestian Troops. Probably another group worth mentioning, which came after soc art, is the group Art or Death. I wanted just to briefly mention it because even though it was a not Moscow-based group, originally it was from Rostov, I think two very important artists came from there, Skashlikov and Taraganyan. For both artistic and political reasons, that's the group that was created in the late 80s and existed through the 90s. So basically, very briefly, we heroically covered the entire Russian 20th century art. Thank you very much for coming, and let's have a glass of wine. Thank you.